wanted it. So it actually led to a lot of destructive, economic stagnation in Africa. The structural adjustment programs and the fact that the Soviet Union collapsed, not being able to help Africa financially.
So I would speak more here on this point about the US-led system. So and some of the flaws it has. So first of all is the fact that it's especially now it's not consistent. So we can look at the case of Iranian nuclear deal that it was signed by the President Obama and his administration, but it was completely reversed and cancelled after that. Even their allies from the European Union was against that, but still the United States left this deal. And because of that, even this year we will have an election, and there can be another great change in American politics. Uh, I'm not sure completely here, but I think that before maybe 1990s, before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. Policy was more consistent. So I mean, administration after administration, still there was one particular course of action, like plan, But now it seems that it changes along with administration. So the second issue is that sometimes the U.S. Internal politics greatly affects foreign policy of the country, and because of that, they also change the agenda, and talking about democracy, like the point Peter raised, I think the issue here, especially as we witnessed in 1990s when Russia was a Western-oriented country, no matter the crises in Russia, no matter the violation of human rights and other things by the government, because it was Western oriented, it was supported only because of that. And because of that, this kind of leadership has no moral value, because they just how to say. Um, for example, there were some prosecutions in Russia in 1990s, but the regime was different. The regime was more loyal to the United States, so there was no issues with that. But now we see even some minor things uh, can meet very aggressive reaction from the Western countries. So I think it's another flaw of such system. And especially we see that like the current case with the International Criminal Court, we see that when Russia was accused of blackmailing like children, but basically it was sorry for me speaking about Russia a lot. I will try to limit myself on that, but I just want to. It's just an example. So, for example, we see the how to say the approach Israel takes to Gaza, to operation in Rafah, and we see the approach Russia takes, and it's you know. Uh, and when International Criminal Court was ordering their arrest warrant for our president, the United States supported it. But the same institution that the United States does not recognize as an official institution make a threat for Prime Minister of Israel, there is an immediate reaction, negative reaction on that. So and in that system, so inconsistent, so mm, concentrated on the needs of one state, it's just an effect from my point of view. It's maybe it's not so effective on the global scale, because if you want to be a hegemon, you need to sometimes be, as in Confucian philosophy, you need to be a just father. You don't need to be, you need to understand, yeah, okay, that's my children, I'm a superior power, so there should be a stability in the system, because in So it will be just not beneficial for me to stay in this system if I'm not if I'm inferior power. So and that is an issue from my point of view. But I think that the major issue here is that the sometimes internal political agenda of the United States is more important than foreign policy, and because of that, they can change. They can drastically and dramatically change their foreign policy approaches.
Just very briefly, so like I mentioned earlier on, I of course would expatiate on the. I don't know if it's is it working? Okay, okay. So I would expatiate on the political side of the situation. Of course, we know by now that there is a nexus between politics and economy. So if at the time we had to adopt a system of government that we're not very familiar with, of course, you would expect that it would have consequences, regardless of the initiatives that we would have developed internally, or the ones that were brought to us from institutions. So, like Peter mentioned, the failure of the SAP. If it had just failed, it would have been really fine if the SAPs had just failed, but they had dire consequences for African countries. So they did not only fail, but they ended up in wrecking the potential that our economies had in Africa. So uh, I think it's just like Peter said. It's not like we have an apology already, but if you consider the fact that we actually received a whole lot of things, I was going to say this when I started talking at first. When African countries got independence from colonial powers and from the colonial lords, we were adopted and we were appropriated into a system that we were not part of the design, and that we were not part of the formation deliberations that led to it. So, and then we had legacies that were consistent in our various geographies. For instance, the system of government that Nigeria adopted was one that was influenced largely by Britain. So, and this was not something that really this was something that we really were used to. This was something that we really were skilled in as far as practice is concerned. So you can expect that it would not be productive in the long run, and this would also affect every other thing that happens within the system. So this is just what I have to say, just very briefly about just I have to say now. So thank you.
One more question before we move to the main thing. So I would like to know your opinion about this stand. So before the Cold War, there used to be um, significant factors like land mass and maritime considerations when it comes to foreign policy decision making. And this was between the United States picking particular African countries and the Soviet Union picking some African countries like Angola. So we would like to know what exactly with these factors, what roles did they play in putting Africa on the map? Is my question clear? I can repeat it if it's not.
Yeah, if I get your question clearly, like what factors does maybe land power and sea power play in shaping, I mean, the politics of Africa? Those are actually very important factors. I mean, important in the sense that great powers consider that and actually use that in their favor. Now, just to go back a little bit again, before the British actually became like the naval superpowers, taking control of the seas, it was actually the Chinese. They also had like a very large navy before the British came about. But they destroyed theirs because the Chinese didn't feel any need at the time to have those navies because there was no one else to conquer. Because the thing is, at that time, there was not a lot of movement, within between continents or trying to conquer very distant lands, because within China there and the surroundings, China had already conquered them and actually established this tributary system wherein they were paying like tributes to the Chinese. But when they destroyed their levy, and then the British now became, I think it was in the beginning of the 17th or 16th centuries, now had to become the naval superpowers controlling the seas. You know, Britain is an island. It's an island, of course, in Europe, but not in mainland Europe, right? So it now controls the seas. Now, the land powers like Germany, for example, you know, Germany in the center of Europe was actually divided. You know, was actually, they had like different German states. And then it was after 1871 when Bismarck, you know, defeated, when the Germans, through Bismarck, of course, defeated France, then they united the German principalities. So that became like more threatening, because now you have a very big land mass within the center of Europe, and very vibrant, powerful, able to threaten any one of them, and they can beat any one of them in war, perhaps except for the British. But Germany became so powerful. And of course, we know before that they've been having issues with France, you know, fighting, you know, and all that. But when Germany became united, they became even more powerful. You know. So now to have like a landmass within that center of Europe, then now wanting to dominate the seas, because when it became powerful, now it became economically rich, now started threatening, challenging Britain, who was actually the lord of the seas, basically, dominating the seas. You know, that, interaction, that conflict between them is partly why in 1914, like a war broke out, basically within them. And at that time, actually, they were all doing very well, very rich, because there was not, apart from France and Germany, which was only limited within them, you know, in 1871, there was no major war for 100 years in Europe. Like, there was no major war. If you exclude also the Crimean War, there was no major war. So they were actually economically developing. No. So, but when Germany became powerful, started threatening Britain, who was actually lord of the seas, then a conflict arose. Now, when Britain now lost that power, it lost that power, I would say, from 1945, because before that, Americans were like very powerful though, but isolationist. They did not want to engage in, I'm just giving a background before touching on Africa. They did not want to engage in the issues of the world. They were isolationist. What they tell the Europeans is that you and your problems, try and solve them there. We are just going to take care of our own issue. Why? Because America was protected by 2 oceans and they only had 2 borders. So there was no threat. It was not the time of nuclear weapons or you have jet fighters within a minute reaching America. So they were like protected. They were like, you and your wars just fight there. That was why, like I said earlier, they came and formed the League of Nations and went back to America, because they did not feel any need to be part of European problems. You fight a lot, but they said to them, well, in our backyard, which is like South America, don't come here. If you try and come here, anybody who try to recolonize, these countries that have already gained independence in South America, we will consider it as an act of war against us. If you try Mexico, France tried it and lost. So now the point here is that to conquer like a piece of land is very important, you know, because it's important and at the same time dangerous. It's dangerous in the sense that states tend, I don't like this idea, to be frank. It's very like annoying. Like states, not African states, I would say Eurocentric ideas, Eurocentric state, European states. Think about a state, a piece of land like an organism. So it has to spread, it has to grow. Just like a human being, from the time you were born to the time you grow up, you have to grow. So if you do not grow, you're gonna die. But what happens? When you start to spread as a state, what do? You conquer other territories, right? So in conquering other territories, you have, of course, it's conflict. You are now bringing conflict to people's doorsteps. This is what the Germans used. They called it Lebensraum, living space. You know, we have to spread. We have to conquer more territory because we are very big. We have a very large population. We have to, but then that puts you into trouble. You run into trouble. You know, in Africa, the idea was not that much to conquer, territory per se, to include them as part of like the Europeans, as part of Britain or as part of France, except for France partly. But the idea was just for each to carve out a piece of land that you can call your own. The people are going to be yours, and their resources are going to be yours. So what you're going to do is just to be exporting that here and there. Where Africa plays a role, especially right now, very important role, is that Africa has choke points, like what you call choke points. We Africans, we don't think in those terms, to be frank. We don't think in those terms. Now, choke points are what? They are kind of like gateways, wherein you can use it strategically to get your enemy. If you take the Suez Canal, for example, in Egypt, it's a choke point. The British used to control it. So why? Because if they have a problem with the Russians, they can block the passage. The Bosphorus, for example, in Turkey, is a choke point, for example. So Turkey and Russia has to make sure it maintains good relations with Turkey. Because if not, to come from the Black Sea through the Bosphorus to now enter the ocean is going to be a problem. So you have to make sure. So Africa has these choke points, and that is why now those choke points in Djibouti, for example, Djibouti from the Red Sea then to the Gulf of Aden, when you're coming from the Indian Ocean, Djibouti also has this choke point, wherein it's a passage. That is where Africa plays like a very big role. But in the sense that land is utilized like strategically within African nations, no. Now within European nations, they don't do that, except for the fact that if it's strategically important. If you take West Africa, just my final point. If you take West Africa, for example, because West Africa is actually not very far from the US. If you stand in the Gambia, perhaps you'll be able to see the cities of, well, I'm kidding. Anyway, but it's not very far. So what happens is, it's threatening. Like, I don't know how people think about this. But we students of international relations, when you're introduced to these things, you become like afraid. Now, what happens is West Africa, especially those countries that are in the coastline, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, what happens is that America would not want a country like Russia or China to have a base there. Why? Because it's very close to America. So for China, now what would be China's strategy is to make sure, I don't know if they want this, or maybe Russia, is that they would have to make sure and try to get like security agreements with the West African countries, have these bases in West Africa, wherein they can be able to get to the US, just in case, because these people, to be frank, I'm sorry calling them these people, they don't trust each other. So they always prepare for tomorrow. That is the thing. They always prepare for tomorrow. They are negotiating, but at the same time, behind their back, they have guns with them. That is the thing. So, but now, Gambia, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, you are in a very difficult position, because if you have an agreement, for example, with Russia or China, let's say a security agreement, wherein you say, okay, come and build your base here, to maybe even support us in our fight against terrorism, America doesn't like that. America doesn't like that, and it's going to do anything possible to make sure that that base cannot happen there. But they are doing it. They are doing it. So just to cut things short, we have to make sure that we don't let those things to happen on African soil. Big power conflicts. We just have to. But we still have more questions to answer. I will talk more on like relations with Russia particularly.
Thank you.
Yeah, talking about I will be very short on this question. So I think the the most important factor is in decolonization process was that the classical empires like British Empire, French Empire was very harshly wounded by the World War II, as the British, in fact. The economy, the pressure on the country was so huge that it was just impossible for them to stay as an empire. And other two players, the new superpowers, they both were for the decolonization. So I think that's the most important point here, is that the classical empires, they are just not they had no powers to maintain the empires, and there was a pressure, and the pressure by the bipolar system by itself. So I think that was the factor that ensured that the decolonization was finished eventually.
Thank you.
On the themes of land and well, in international relations, we look at these resources from the strategic point of view. So we consider factors like resources, for instance, and the defining factor that these resources can have, for instance, during military, for instance, during war, for example. So how can this area or piece of land be vital, defining, if you're having, if you're in conflict with an enemy nation, or how can this piece of resource, land or water, what resources are there embedded in it that can serve your purpose? So, well, like they've said, yeah, just like they've said, yeah, these things are there, and even now it's happening a lot more, but not in Africa, by the way, because you know, we do not have this rivalry in Africa among African states. We do not have any of such competition as to who's going to be the regional power in Africa, and then who will be the secondary, or the secondary power. So we do not have any of such issues right now in Africa. So, but it's all part of the narrative of states, or let me say the idea of states turning frontiers into borders. So the basic ideas, for instance, for tussle and conflict over resources like land, like pieces of rocks, I'm sorry to say that. So pieces of rocks, lands and water areas, it's just there basically. It may be there just to fuel nationalism. For instance, the state is trying to get its people together, have a united front against the foreign state, and then they do these kind of things to make sure that they get support from their publics. So the idea is just to maybe fuel nationalism, or, like I said earlier on, if that resource, maybe a piece of land or water or coastal area, coastal areas or piece of land or rocks, if they serve strategic purposes. For instance, let me just say this very briefly. An example would be perhaps if you're familiar with territorial dispute in Asia. So you would know that they're fighting over rocks that do not even serve any purpose. The rocks are not habitable. The rocks are not habitable. There are probably no resources in them, because the idea that there are resources in them are actually they have actually not been verified. So, but we see states fighting over them because, like I said earlier on, there are two states fighting. Maybe there are two or more states fighting over this piece of resource, and then the publics want the states to. The publics in both countries, or 3 or more countries, would want their states to be the one that acquire the resource, because it's a way to keep the publics together. And if perhaps it serves military or strategic purposes, then maybe. So, but ideally, these things are not obtainable. They are not obtainable in Africa. We do not have contest and tussle over a piece of land, over any of such things. Even when there was a case between Nigeria and Cameroon over the Bakassi Peninsula, we saw that Nigeria, when the case was taken to international court, it was resolved amicably, peacefully. Even though, despite the fact that the Bakassi Peninsula had oil, large reserve of oil, Nigeria had to let the entire piece of area, Nigeria had to let it go to Cameroon. It wouldn't happen perhaps in Europe or in Asia, because I'm sorry to say, because of consideration, for instance, for the value, the economic value of that area. So these things are not obtainable in Africa, but of course they happen all over in Europe and in Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, moving to the main question. In your opinion, do you think the current world order has contributed to Africa's development? In your opinion, what do you think? Very briefly.
Very briefly. Let me see if I can do that. A short answer would be no and yes. No, in the sense that just hypothetically, Africa could be what it could have been more than what it is today, if indeed the system was fair. Now, we have a political system, right, like we mentioned earlier, and the political system is not actually in line, if I can put it that way, it's not actually in line with African way of things, African way of doing things, African values. Because our politics in Africa used to be what? Through chiefs, our leaders were what? Chiefs, you know, kingdoms and the like. We never had like presidents. The idea of a president actually came later. This came from the West to Africa. And I wouldn't say it's a bad thing, but because politics at the top has not been able to actually organize society, to use society's energies to be able to produce those goods and economic benefits for society. That's one thing. The economic aspect of it is that for centuries, in fact, since colonialism, Africa has been this continent just for the production of raw materials. We produce raw materials and export them to Europe, and then in Europe they are going to be manufactured into finished goods and sell back to Africa. We've talked about this like numerous times here. That is still happening.
like it's in the system, even despite the fact that today it is an African heading the World Trade Organization, a Nigerian, but still, but this is a system. I'm not sure she has much influence to change this system, because why? It is a system that is actually um, led by the most powerful states. So it is what they say that matters. And these most powerful states now have um, large corporations, like you would say, Google, Microsoft, Apple. Now, if they want to do business in Africa, and the terms of agreement are not actually favorable to them, what they do is they would have to go back to their countries and whine and complain to their governments. Now, their governments now, because the thing about the US particularly is that, you know, it is the military that comes first, and then the economics follow. Now, you will have to, a gun will have to be pointed at you for you to sign an agreement, an economic agreement, even if it's not favorable. So when they went to their states would now come and either try to either in some domains impose sanctions, or sometimes maybe cut some funding, or maybe there would be like an outcry that it's not fair, you're creating some kind of protectionism. Even if Ghana or Gambia or Nigeria wants to say, okay, let's try to help our indigenous population, our local people to develop their industries. Let's try to develop our local industries. Let's make sure that the gold that we have in Ghana is going to be processed in Ghana. Our local industry is going to process it. Now, the gold processing companies of the West or the large corporations would not agree with that, because you are actually taking their business, you are actually taking their profit. They are going to go to their governments and cry, and their governments are going to come to the government of Ghana and start to maybe give them some, sometimes they are basically bribes. Yeah, basically they are bribes. That is the thing. Sometimes basically they are just bribes. And then the government of Ghana will be like, okay, we're going to sell now this part to maybe some gold producing company of the world. So the system basically, the good side of it is that, you know, because we are in an era wherein the world is more globalized. We have like globalization, as they call it. So there's this transfer of like goods and services from highly developed countries to those countries that are developing. And you have transfer sometimes, not all the time, sometimes of technology. But critical technology actually is not transferred. That is for certain. Critical technology is not actually transferred. There are some technologies that are transferred. The thing is, it's inevitable, because people are moving and ideas are going to move. They cannot stop it even if they want to. But the thing is, by and large, there is not that transfer. There is not that much benefit that this current world order has actually given to Africa.
I mostly agree with Peter here on the negative sides, and I would like here to concentrate on positive sides and talk more on that. So, and I think this system, as I know, the GDP per capita in African countries from 1970 increased 6 times. So, and yes, there is a big question of how technology influenced that, but there is no such growth in Russia, I think. So, or the Soviet Union, I mean Russia. Yes, we have a crisis, but still, you know, and it was the international capitalist system that ensured that. And even now, again, I'm speaking about Russia, but we are put like it's connected to Africa. So we are put under immense number of sanctions, but still the resources, the goods from Russia can come to Africa, and it's not only because of the technologies; it's because of the institutions as well. So I think that. This system allowed for this interconnectedness, and yes, it has its big flaws for Africa, and there should be some political pressure to deal with it. But I think that if we look at the development of Asia, for example, yes, also South Korea or China now, yeah, we can see that China first worked on some very light industries. Yes, and there was not talking about technologies, but now in some very high added value industries, Chinese industries are just great. You know, in some they are producing some very good goods, and I think that for Africa, that this system allows for this growth. Eventually, Africa needs to be, from my point of view, to gain more power. it needs a political will, a pressure to the system. But for now, as I see it, the most important issue is the economic growth, because economy is a hard power of nation. If you do not have economic hard power, it's hard for you to, to pressure. Like why for the United States it's very hard to impose harsh sanctions on China. Not only because they are so interconnected, but because China is a powerhouse of the world now. So, and if Africa becomes powerhouse of the world, there could be a more power to that, and and it can assert its influence and its position on the world stage. And I think that this system we have now allows for that. But the problem is that it is becoming more and more. It's becoming harder for to maintain the market mechanism. Sometimes for some countries, I would not name them, but the assets were frozen. Very big assets, like $300 billion, and they are now talking about nationalizing this money and sending it to other country, and um, it will destroy the whole system if it happens. And there are threats to the system. But basically, I think that the core, the main ideas, they have big flaws, and Peter named that. But there are also some, like SWOT analysis. There are some opportunities. And, Africa have a great chance to capitalize on this and become a very developed region and later powerhouse of the world, like China now, like industry powerhouse. So because it has everything for its future. It has an immense amount of people. It has an abundant resources. Like one of the reasons why Chinese industry production is sometimes so cheap comparing to European, because they have the full, production cycle. They have resources for that Europeans don't have. So I think that for Africa, there is a chance here also. So, and I think that for now, as there are not, economically speaking, there is not such big amount of hard power. For now, African, how to say, direction should be to develop an economy, and after that, the political action.
It's working? Oh, okay, good. So it's important for me to emphasize now that my arguments are not that Africa should be Africa as a continent, so African states as units or state actors should be a world power. That's not what I'm arguing. So I'm only saying I think we're talking about economic development, at least for the most part of it. So on the question of how fair that the current world order has been to Africa and to African states, so well, we've talked about policies like the SAP and then the adoption of foreign system of governance that were not suitable, that we were not conversant with, and that were not skilled here. So now perhaps if you're familiar with various theories of development, you would know about the world system theory that explained that the international system is made up of core states and semi-periphery and periphery states. So there are states that actually they are provider of raw materials, and then there are states that are the ones who they are producer of finished goods, and then they have the technological sophistication to process raw materials and then to export them. So largely the idea of Africa being, or not just the idea, but the reality of Africa being exporter of raw materials has been something since during colonialism. Africa since during colonialism has been exporting raw materials, and it's still the same. It's still very much similar to what we have till today. So it's not like we're really producing some of these things; we have to export them. So so maybe in a way, I can argue for that. It's not really been fair that we've been subject to the same position since back during colonialism up until now. So, but of course, it's important to also mention the eco consideration for some of these ideas. By eco consideration, I'm talking about the environmental consideration. Development in itself is depending on what nature of development can have consequences for the human environment. So permit me to say this: I am an environmentalist. So there are environmental consequences for development, especially if African countries have to go the same way European countries have gone. If you have to go the same way America has gone, or if the likes of China has gone, we would contribute. We would be contributing to environmental degradation in a way. So we are having there are discussions in development studies now for African countries to adopt cleaner. By cleaner, I mean emissions-free. Emissions-free. That's what I mean by clean. So cleaner models of development. So we don't have to rely excessively on consuming and on the usage of fossil fuels. For instance, we can use more clean source of fuel to attain development. So because maybe it's important to mention this just for context that Africa is suffering largely from the development paths that Europe and America and Asia have taken over the years. For instance, permit me to also say this again. We had the 1989 Mauritania-Senegal crisis was over land. Actually, it was over land. But I think I said earlier on, the African countries don't fight over resources, but this was different, by the way, because the development path that Europe and let me say the West have taken over time had resulted in environmental degradation, and Africa, for instance, had suffered over the course of time. For instance, from the fact that there were so much emissions that impacted human environment. So, like I said, the Senegal Mauritanian crisis was an issue over land between both countries. So maybe maybe I'll say a little bit about that. So these lands were used for farming and very intensive farming. So, but because of the soil degradation, there was need for the government. I think it was an initiative that was actually advised by the World Bank that this piece of land should be irrigation systems just to make farming more productive in 1980s, just before the crisis in 1989. So we saw that the moment the initiative was shared by the World Bank and the state had to swing into action, then there were crises between both countries, because maybe you may want to read about that, by the way, so just to not bore you with that story. So eventually what happened was that there was crisis between Senegal and Mauritania, because the piece of land that were captured and calibrated into a project were piece of land that were controlled by Senegalese. And so Senegalese had to be they were expelled. Let me use the word expelled. So maybe another word would be when the state sends people out, like deported. So they were deported from Mauritania back into Senegal because they wanted to control that area because of the economic value in the long run. So maybe eco-conservation was maybe one of the reasons why, maybe one of the things that we need to consider. Another thing would be that to say, because I think it's fair to say, just like Peter said directly when he answered the question that was raised by Christina, if the current order has been fair to Africa or not. Yes and no, no and yes. So because maybe it's possible to do a comparative analysis of the economic progress of all African countries since independence. That would give us an idea. If all of the countries are on par, then we can assume that maybe it's largely external. But if all of the countries are not on par, if some countries have progressive economies as compared to others, then maybe there are also internal factors to consider, not just external factors. So the idea of starting from powerhouse, just like Oleg mentioned, the idea of powerhouse, it may not be necessary for us to go the same way Europe and the West have gone. There is the idea of leapfrogging. Maybe you can read about that. It's called leapfrogging. So leapfrogging is not having to do the same thing that developed countries did. We can actually leverage on existing technologies to develop our own development path, unique to us, without having to go the same way they went by. For instance, having to develop your own technologies from the scratch and starting to use them and all that. So we don't have to do that anymore. We can just leverage on what's existing and then carve our own development path. An example would be that African countries, developing countries don't have to use landmines. We just went from almost no means of communication to using mobile phones. So we didn't have to go through landmines. So thank you. That's all I have to say.
very, very brief. I think that Africa should, the system is rigged, as Peter said, but still there are opportunities, and Africa should capitalize on these opportunities. Opportunities the system provides for them as a free economic market system, as I've mentioned before. First, and the second, wait for the window of opportunity, because I think that the economic system will change in 20 years, maybe 30 years. I mean, for example, with the petrodollars, the end of the petrodollar system. In this way, the natural resources will be very important, and countries with natural resources can gain more power, as I've mentioned. Like, for example, now you can see countries started to buy a lot of gold, and there is some reason for that. They did not buy so many dollars, I mean, but started to invest in gold, and there is a reason. I think that using this strategy, it's like quite safe for Africa and can allow for the future growth.
To be, I'll try to be brief also. I think the last banter talked about patriotism as a factor to consider. It seems meager. Actually, it seems very, very insignificant. But maybe if we consider that for most developed countries, the public actually are patriotic. They love their country. Now, maybe insignificant actually, maybe insignificant. But, you know, the problem, or let me say, the issue at hand is not just external. It's a fusion of both external and internal factors. And then we cannot talk about internal factors without talking about the African person. That's the African person. So let me give an instance for I think Oleg mentioned briefly, he mentioned some minutes ago about China's development of light industries. And then historically, maybe on that, I think under Chairman Mao Zedong, I remember that, of course, I had read that China attempted to industrialize, and then they were not reliant on what they could get from outside countries. They were more reliant on what they could get from within. In fact, it was so deliberate that the people, what they wanted to do then was to have their own supply of steel, because they needed for industries. Just so you know what people did. The average Chinese brought out their bed frames that had iron, and they had them melted just to produce steel that the country needs for its industries. Of course, it was not successful because that approach was not sustainable. You cannot make steel from that kind of approach. But it also tells that the fact that it went on for that long means that there is a game change. There's a defining moment, a defining point in what the people are wanting to do something for their country. There's a defining point in that. Also, we can also talk about the Great Leap Forward. When China was also developing industry, and they needed to grow food for the industry. There were still the people who did it. So, of course, maybe when we start to answer questions, I will say some more things about leapfrogging and free movement, like Peter mentioned. Thank you.
All right, so I think I'll start first. My name is Aka Elijah once again, third year medical student. I'm from Nigeria. I actually noticed that the flow of the questions was coming this way, so I'm going to go like this. I don't know if I'm going to get another opportunity to ask a question, so I have 3 questions, one each for the 3 panelists. So yeah, the first question goes to Master Shea. All right, so a few months ago, President Putin, during the Russia-African Summit, he said that, of course, we're going to have a new world order, and Africa is going to be one of the key players in the new world order. So now, my question is, do you think Africa is actually truly ready to play a key role in this new world order we're talking about? And of course, we've talked about economics, we've talked about politics, military, and technology. Do you think Africa has all of these 4 aspects in place, politically, economically, technologically, and militarily, to be a key player in the emerging world order? And then my second question goes to, okay, one. All right. All right. So my second question goes to Master Oleg. So what the current world order we have, America is one of the biggest players. Actually, it's the biggest player in this current world order. And if we're to have a new world order, right, a bipolar world order, do you think there are some lessons to learn from America? What has really helped them to maintain this dominance over the past, like, few years or maybe decades? Do you think there are some lessons to learn? And if there are some lessons to learn, do you think these lessons are going to be necessary in the new world order? Like, the world order we're going to have now, is it necessary to carry out some of these lessons, like to use the approach America has used to maintain dominance over these years? And if you think we can go that way, like, can you tell us some of the methods America used? And then if you think we cannot necessarily use some of those methods, what then are some better options, like approaches to use in the new emerging world order, different from what America has used over these past years? Thank you. And then my last question goes to Peter Mendy. Yeah, I think it's very important. Like, let me just. You got your question, right? Okay, and then you got your question. Okay, and then my question now goes to Peter Mendy. So, in this current world order we have now, African countries, of course, they relate more with America and all of that. But in the past few years, we've been having some military coups in Africa. These military coups, I don't completely endorse them, neither do I condemn them. So yeah, and then when we have a new world order, some African countries, do you think there's a place for neutrality? Okay, I don't want to be this side, I don't want to be this side. Like, do you think there's going to be a place for neutrality? And if at all there is, can you tell us more about it? And then when we have a bipolar world, do you think it's going to, because we're already talking about Pan-Africanism, is Africa united and all of that, do you think this is going to further deepen the divide between African countries? Because when some countries are on one side of the world order and then some countries are on the other side, do you think this is going to create an internal crisis within Africa, or it's actually going to, like, foster a competitive ground for Africa to develop more? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm Eben, and I say at the School of Biomedicine, Medicine. So I think Elijah's question is very broad, and I think we have to put it in perspective, because all this we're talking of Africa, right? And he laid his question on the premises that at least a country is thinking of Africa and wants us to be among, the determinants of a world order, that is. Yeah. So the thing is, normally we consider Africa as a country. So in what way are we going to take part? Is it as a continent or as a country? And going forward, what should Africa do? Should we unite, perhaps to be United States of Africa to be able to compete, or should just single out one country? Because, you compare Africa with the United States, and I think we are comparing like apples and maybe oranges. United States is a country, Africa is a continent. So let's put that in perspective. Thank you.
Written. Okay. So for the question of if again, is Africa ready to be a participant in the current world order, politically, militarily, economically, and then technology-wise? Well, of course, it's not like we're not participant right now. We're participants. It's just not fair. All right. So what we're looking to have is a more fair, more world order that's reflective of the African interest, one that rewards our participation and our participation and inclusion in the system. So, like I said, the concept of leapfrogging provides an avenue for African countries to to, just like maybe for Russia, it provides an opportunity for us to partner with Russia. I do not know I do not know what the intent of the president is. I don't know what his intentions are, by the way. So, but whatever light he sees it, leapfrogging as a concept and as an initiative can help Africa to partner effectively, because we do not have to develop our own technologies. We can simply leverage on existing technologies. We don't have to start from 1G. We can start what's available. That's what I meant by leapfrogging. We don't have to start from the scratch. We can start what's available. So, militarily, I have a lot of reservation about that, but I have a lot of reservation. But okay. So let me live militarily for my. It's safe to live militarily. I think it's safe. It's safe to live militarily. So, but politically, let me talk about the system. The African the system. Like I mentioned earlier on, development in Africa is not development in itself. In Africa is not just as a sort of external factors. It's also very internal. We're from different African countries, but we can tell you what the situation is, what the situation of our country is internally. I'm sure we're very familiar with development in itself, but no entrepreneur, no business person, no organization, no corporation will bring their business into regions that's ridden with conflict, that's ridden with all kinds of violence. So there should be stability, and that's the function of the government, the function of the system, not Bretton Woods. It's not going to be Russia that's going to do that for us. It has to be done by the state in itself. So there should be the entire environment should be conducive politically, socially, should be conducive to partner with Russia in the projected new world order. So that's what I have to say about politics and then technologically.
So the question was about what we can learn from the United States system, and first is the stability of economic system. So the stability of the US dollar, and that's the thing that businessmen put their money from all over the world in the Western countries, and they know that they are safe, the investments are safe, the economic system is stable, so it's very beneficial. Second, I think is the system of work with NGOs, and for example, I think that in Africa there are a lot of Western funded NGOs, and they are very effective, and they provide people with a sense of change, of some kind of idealism, and can be useful to promote foreign policy of a country. And talking about the question that was about should Africa be act as a united actor or not, I think that there are sometimes some mega trends that influence every country, and every country of Africa should have a response on that. So that's why I think it's not maybe it should be more countries based on nation, like ethnicities, like in our Western understanding it's more like we have nation states, so they should be based on ethnicities, but the world is changing, so it's not a universal way. Yeah, that's all.
So I will also start from there. Please.
I'm sorry. No question. Just to
Well,
verify.
just I'm talking about like no, I mean Evans question about comparing, Africa to the US.
For you, Elijah, what was the question supposed to
No,
answer?
I'll answer Elijah's question.
No, just Elijah's question.
Oh, all right,
It's 2 minutes.
all right. So now the thing is, it's very difficult to be neutral. Of Can we do it? Um, you have to take maybe China's example, because you have to make sure that you don't tell your guys. I mean, you don't show your card. After you didn't say what it's supposed to do or what it's going to do, because China didn't. We have to grow economically. I believe, like alluded to this, we grow economically first until we become, let's say, financially solvent, economically strong. Then we will be able to shape our politics. But the thing is, what China did, what China did, what China did was that while they were developing economically, just a minute, while they were developing economically, um, the US particularly thought that, okay, let's just allow them to develop. Let's bring them into the World Trade Organization. Let's give them like a favored nation, like most favored nation in terms of trade. That was in 2000, year 2000. Even George Bush said this. Let's allow them. So when we allow them, over time, they are going to change their politics and they are going to become a democratic state. But that did not happen with China. So now with Africa, I think they have learned that lesson and they're not going to allow us. That is the thing. But we have to make sure that we fight. We have 54 countries. We have 54 countries, 1.4 billion people now. We have to make sure that we fight and then gain that economic freedom for ourselves, and then we'll be able to rule ourselves politically. Thank you.
Did anyone answer your question? Yeah. Did anyone answer your question?
Yeah, you attempted to block it, but
Thank you. Thank you so much. So my name is Ksenia, and I guess Alec told us about hard power that it's necessary to develop economy to get hard power. And I know that in Africa there is ECOWAS, and also I guess there are 15 members. I think that it is necessary maybe to unite all African countries to develop economy. Do you think that there is the problem to unite all the country, maybe to expand ECOWAS, expand membership of this union? Do you think that it is necessary to unite all African countries? What is the problem to unite?
I think that question is posed to
I would like to pass it to Peter. I see he wants to talk.
just 1 minute.
All right. So political unity of Africa is actually debated. Should we unite into one African government instead of having national governments? It's actually still debated, and I'm not actually in favor of political unity. Understand? Because sooner or later we are going to be divided again. That is the thing. Because remember, you want to bring on board 1.4 billion people under one political unit. Some people
say the United Nations comes like to a unanimous decision to like have a rotational power sharing. Let's say like the world power, so-called world power, the giant. You know, let's say that America, how America is like leading the world in a lot of things, especially when it comes to decision making in the United Nations. So let's say all the countries come to an agreement that it will be rotational. So do you think at any point in time it will reach Africa's turn? And if it does, who are we going to nominate as a nation? And as a continent, I mean. And is that even achievable? This is a question like for the all of them, but maybe they can nominate one person to answer.
Minute. I'll try. So, permit me to say that if we have to do a ranking, if we decide to rank issues of importance, permit me to say that that's very far from what Africa actually needs, quite honestly. You know, for instance, being the UNSC has functions. You know, the UNSC, usually the main function is to ensure law, to ensure peace and security. Africa is not even peaceful. I mean, yeah, African continent not peaceful. The environment is not even suitable. Like I said earlier on, it's not even suitable, conducive for development. So we cannot leave domestic issues, regional issues, and back on global issues. We are not ready for it. Honestly, we're not ready for it.
Shay, I think 1 minute is up, so we'll pass it to Mr. Oleg.
I think the country that in Africa that can be a part of the Security Council, for me it's South Africa, because I think it's the most balanced country. Like the majority of members of the Security Council, permanent members, can agree. Both the Western countries and China, Russia can agree on inclusion of this country. So I think it would be the best option.
Thank you.
Yeah, the thing is, like, of course, in the UN General Assembly, all countries are equal, so everyone has like one vote. But in the UN Security Council, that's where the problem is. So, like he said, South Africa is actually touted as the most viable candidate, and sometimes Nigeria. But Nigeria, I have reservations because of the internal problems. It's a different thing. In Nigeria, the problem is the government cannot maintain security in some parts of Nigeria. And if a government cannot have control over a territory within its own country, that's a problem. In South Africa, that doesn't happen. You know, in America, that doesn't happen. The state. No, what I mean is the state has control over all its territory. So nobody can deny the state somewhere in a territory. In Nigeria, you have these problems. Now, the thing is, whether it can be rotational. Of course, it can, not only South Africa, but like we said, it should be rotational. South Africa today, maybe some region, some country in ECOWAS, and maybe East Africa, and maybe not Africa. But like she said, it's right, I think. We have to be able to solve our problems. At least deal with your own issues first. You know, start with yourself, your family, your country, maybe your village, and then before you go conquering the world, you know. That's the thing.
Okay, thank you very much. That would be all for today. There is no more time for more questions. So we've come to the end of this episode, and seriously, I think it's been an intense one. I hope you guys enjoyed these great discussions, because our panelists have put in much effort into this, and I really appreciate you for sharing your knowledge, your international relation knowledge with everyone here. I want to especially thank Mr. Oleg for coming onto this show and giving you all to explain what you think about African countries. Thank you very much. I would also like to thank Peter Mendy, of course, the project manager of this whole project. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to be here. And I would like to thank Sheyi for being here today. Thank you. You surpassed our expectations. We're really grateful for you being here. I would like to appreciate the ASAP media team. Thank you very much for making this a success. Thank you. We really, really appreciate you for putting in the time and effort to be here, to capture the whole wonderful moment. And to Uliana, thank you for showing up every time we have this program. We appreciate your effort. I don't know if Simeon is still here. We appreciate you. Every everyone here, we say thank you, a big thank you to every one of you. To the audience, we appreciate you for joining us every time, taking your time and listening to our great panelists. So that's going to be the end for today. And I think in the next 2 weeks, yeah, we're going to have another episode, and it would be really, really great if we can see all these beautiful faces again. So yeah, we are done. Thank you so much for coming. See you next time. Bye.